Hi everyone, I'm Wiam Rotban, and I'm one of the co-authors of the Turning Towards Each Other Conflict Workbook. I'll introduce myself and then pass it to Joe to introduce theirself. I use she and they pronouns. I am Syrian. I grew up in the United States South on Caddo and Osage lands. To parents who were Syrian revolutionaries displaced from Syria for dissent against the regime. And that's sort of what politicized me and gave me a taste and a hunger for justice. And I spent my adult life here in Oakland, California, where I live now, working in Arab communities, supporting survivors of violence, supporting survivors of war, and doing organizing and cultural production for the Arab community here to bring into being the world that we wanted to see here in diaspora when we couldn't access our ancestral lands. And really the story of my family's displacement is kind of what it brings my heart to conflict transformation work, just knowing the history of how, like after colonialism, we still really hurt each other in my country, like a dictator came, felt like no one else could lead and decided to grab all the power and in a really extractive way that's had generational reverberations that have impacted me and so many. So my name means my first name Wiam means harmony, and my last name Rabban means the furious. So I feel like it contains my ancestral commitment to finding harmony and justice through rage for my people and all people. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass it to Jovita to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Liam. So my name is Jovita. I also go by Jo, she or they pronouns, and I live on Ohlone land in Oakland, California. I grew up in a family, both of my parents grew up in families that were abusive, both physically and emotionally. And they really did their best to not pass that on to me. And it is entirely possible to pass on intergenerational trauma without intending to, and without physical violence being involved. And my family didn't do conflict well. So when I was, as a young adult, I started looking for how could I learn skills to do conflict better? Because I didn't want to continue that pattern. I'll actually, before I go forward, share that my mother's family were small-scale farmers who came from Western Europe, different parts of Western Europe to the US early in the United States history. So essentially small-scale settler colonialists. And my father's family were refugees from anti-Semitic pogroms in Eastern Europe. And I grew up in Northern California in Nisenan and Maidu Miwok lands. Really appreciate all the community I've been able to work with and learn from and with here in the Bay Area. And I started with the story of growing up in a family that didn't do conflict well to say that, seeking out the tools is different than knowing how to apply them consistently. And so to say that Wiam and I come to this work as learners, that we started looking for resources for ourselves and our communities. And so our intent here is to offer and be involved in mutual support to build our collective muscles around conflict and to learn from and with each other. Neither of us are experts in this work, nor professional conflict mediators. And, you know, just know that many of you have lessons to share as well.
Yeah, it kind of makes me want to talk about like why we created this workbook. And it was because, so Jovita and I met at an organization called Movement Strategy Center. And we were sort of supporting movement leaders to think more transformatively and in terms of longer multi-generational arcs into the future, and also to embody the change that they wanted to see beginning with themselves. And we sort of identified that there's a growing body of work to address major harm, you know, this whole world of transformative justice and community accountability, and not everything needs that level of intervention. And what's really like severely lacking in social justice spheres is basic conflict literacy and capacity, like just enough like confidence and curiosity and like adeptness to be able to not shy away from hard conversations and make important decisions about strategy and decision making. Is there anything else you want to say about that, Joe?
Nope, you covered it.
Yeah, so we want to get to know who's in the space with us. So we had some poll questions that we would love if Eva could queue up to just see who's in this Zoom virtual room with us. So the first question is, how many years of practice do you have engaging with conflict consciously? The second one is, what's your primary motivation for being here? Is it to bring these tools to your work, your personal life, your organizing, all of the above? And then to rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being I usually really avoid conflict, and 5 being I usually grab conflict by the horns, so we can get a sense of where people are at. So the results are coming in. I feel like I should do like a do, 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 do.
Well, while results are coming in, I could say what we're doing today.
Yeah.
So we're going to give an introduction and overview to the Turning Towards Each Other conflict workbook that we put together. We won't have time today to do a lot of experiential practice. You can think of it like today we're giving you the menu to hopefully whet your appetite to go deeper. And you can go deeper on your own using the workbook. And we also will be offering some ways to practice together coming up. And at the end of the session today, we'll offer a way to be in touch. But just to say, it will probably feel like we're breezing through the content because we are. So we will have time for questions at the end, and feel free, of course, to use the Q&A function in Zoom.
Yeah, we could basically do a workshop on like every single page of the workbook, you know, but we hope that you'll take this as an opportunity to dive in further on your own. So let's see the poll results. Are you all seeing the results, or do we have to? Oh, okay, great. So it looks like the majority of folks are in the kind of 1 to 5 year practice space. Awesome. And a fair amount of 0 to 1 year. And we've got a couple of 10+ year veterans with us. Salute you. Yeah, and I'm curious to hear from you folks as we go through these tools, if they resonate and how you might apply them. Primary motivation looks like resoundingly all of the above: work, personal life, and social justice organizing. Although interestingly, work seems to be the smallest percentage. And let's see, where are people on the scale of avoidant to confrontational? It looks like kind of in the middle. And when we do this in other workshops, we do this kind of spectrum where you can also demarcate how many tools you feel like you have to address conflict. And it's interesting to see that like sometimes people have tools, but they still really avoid conflict, or people super confront conflict, but don't necessarily have tools. I was talking to my mom the other day and she was like, oh yeah, I confront conflict all the time, but like, do I do it consciously? No. So it's just super interesting to see. Thank you all for sharing. We can stop sharing the poll results now. Yeah, so I usually start our workshops with just like a moment of embodiment. So I'm going to invite folks, if it's comfortable for you, totally optional, to just take a quick moment to settle into your current moment experience. Whatever is happening for you here and now, whether it's like taking a moment to see what you see in front of you, or feel your breath, or feel your seat being held by a chair. And just take a moment to connect with some aspect of your experience that's pleasant or neutral if you can. And inviting you to just set an intention for how you want to show up in this space and what you're hoping to receive. Inviting you to imagine that there's a whole garden of other people's intentions in this virtual space that we're planting together. And may they blossom and bloom in our time together. So Jill, let's talk about conflict.
Yeah, so because you all are here today, I'm guessing you're on board with the idea that conflict is normal. But especially because we framed this, the workbook as about turning towards conflict as gifts for social change. Just wanted to name that if we think of ourselves as social change agents who are trying to create the world we envision, we have to be willing to start with ourselves. And if we want to live in a caring world, we need to do that work ourselves to center and care for our relationships. And we see this work of tending to our conflicts with each other as an essential part of caring for our relationships. And to name that everything that's living constantly evolves, and that includes us as humans, and our relationships, and our groups and teams, and the world we're living in. So sometimes tensions will arise as an indicator that more change is needed, that it's time to adapt. So Liam, what would you say are some of the gifts of conflict?
Yeah, if we can turn towards each other in conflict with mutual care and a commitment to growth, like really, really, if there's one thing that you can just like leave here with, one nugget, it's like, don't be afraid to turn towards conflict for it to be a teacher. It's here to teach you something. And it can like that something can be such a gift, even if it's super painful in the process. So we have just a couple of these gifts of conflict. And while we're sharing, we would love if folks share in the chat, what do you feel like have been gifts of conflict for you when you've been able to move through conflict with love and care? So one of the ones we talk about is so much of conflict arises because like some important core need has been missed. And when you can like, you know, excavate through all of the pain to find that core need, it's such a gift to connect to, because that core need connects you to some value. You may have a core need of autonomy, and that has been missed by someone in a conflict, and that connects you to your value of freedom and justice. And when we're connected to our values and driven by our values, we're much less likely to cause harm in the world. So that's a gift of conflict, to connect us to our core values and needs. Any of these other ones that you want to highlight, Joe?
So I think the message that Miriam shared around transformative love, this piece that tending to conflict is one way that we heal the neglected parts of ourselves that need love. It's a way of loving ourselves.
And I'm seeing some beautiful answers in the chat, like provides a powerful reminder of the inherent worth of others and myself. Beautiful. Feeling rooted in my own self-worth and values, and being able to be in relationship from that place. Relief and growth. Yes.
Yeah. Amazing answers, you all, in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Anything else from the list, Joe, that you want to uplift?
Around strategy, I know I've had the experience, and even in a group that you were a part of with me, Liam, of where I assumed that we all knew where we were going, and it was through conflict that we came to realize that we had different assumptions. And it was the conflict that helped us become aware, like, oh, actually our strategy is fuzzy, and we need to do some work to clear up where we're heading here.
Totally. Did you say the power dynamics one? I was like deep in the chat, and okay.
Nope.
A really important gift of conflict is that like we may have these lofty social justice and liberation ideals, and yet have parts of ourselves that are completely unknown to us, where we are hoarding power or enacting domination on other people. And relationships are a great way to shine a light on those hidden parts and shine a light and surface the way that power dynamics are going on unchecked inside of each of us, which is what happens when we're swimming within these power structures of anti-Blackness, of racism, of colonialism, sexism, etc. So really, like, even though it's so painful, if we can just see it as an opportunity to let those places be seen and be interrupted and replaced with liberatory practices and expectations. Yeah, anything else?
Like
in the
airing
chat?
out the funk. Well, just the last one on our slide, I saw a bunch of people echo that, and just the experience of actually working through conflict. Sometimes we're afraid that it'll end relationships, but if we're able to do it with care, that often it actually strengthens relationships.
Yes. And just a couple more to uplift from the chat. Generates new solutions to problems. Totally. Dynamic tensions can lead to like solutions that we didn't think of before, without the kind of like push and pull that conflict can help initiate. Thank you all. So we want to share a little bit about like why we structured our workbook the way we did. But first,
actually, you might be going where I was going to go. So I wanted to make sure to name that today we're addressing kind of everyday disagreements. Rather, we're not addressing situations of ongoing abuse. and to name that these kind of conflict skills or conflict tools, if we try to apply them in situations of ongoing abuse, we can end up exhausting ourselves and potentially, staying in a bad situation. So just to name that that's not our intention with this, and that here we're looking to build our skills to address conflicts before an accountability process or anything that formal is needed. And hopefully things don't get to that place and there's not the abuse of power involved. And just to say, so this is like your average conflict with your roommate or your coworker or, the people that you're in ongoing regular relationship with.
Yes, thanks, Jo. Abhinay, could we go to the next slide, please? So we structured our workbook in 3 sections, and we'll talk about why in a second, but we also want to address that a lot of people think that good conflict transformation is just like, if we tackle our communication and just like communicate non-violently or, in the way that gets our need across, like that is what conflict is about. When actually we feel like that's the tip of the iceberg. So the big chunks of the conflict transformation iceberg below the surface that are super important in order to make conflict generative and useful is, and Abhinay, if you wouldn't mind advancing a couple times till the text comes up. Yeah, and maybe one more time. Is the self-work, because you can use tools forever and ever, and if you haven't actually like embodied and use those tools on yourself, you are just using those tools as a bludgeon for other people. And so the self-work is really about you addressing your own internalized dominant culture patterns, you like tending to your own pain and your own stories, and resourcing yourself so that you can really show up and caring for yourself. The next chunk of the iceberg is good maintenance work. So that's like relationship and group maintenance work, like a regular practice of appreciation. Oh my gosh, so important. And again, not to become a formula, but like really truly embodying appreciation as a group practice, not like I'm forcing you to have to do this, but to oil the gears of your and wheels of your group, to the regular practice of giving and receiving feedback, of attending to your group's shared purpose, strategy, and vision, and getting clear on that. And committing to your group's process of interrupting how dominant culture shows up. And then that third part of the conflict transformation iceberg is more likely to be successful because it's like held by this deeper work that's being done. And that is, spoiler alert, how we structured this set of tools, starting with self, moving into group, and ending with the conversation and communication tools. Yeah, Jo, do we want to move into our favorite part of the self-exploration section?
Yeah, let's dig into it.
Okay, Abhinay, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide. So this is a little snapshot. Oh, go ahead.
Nope, go ahead.
Oh. This is, I feel like we're in Reading Rainbow, like, here's our book, we're gonna read to you from it. This is a snapshot from our self-exploration section. We have a meditation for resourcing oneself. We have a worksheet that connects you with what gives you purpose, what brings you joy. This is when the going, oh yes.
1 second, yeah. We're just waiting to pin the ASL person so that they can be seen. Okay, great. Awesome, please go ahead.
Totally. when the going gets rough, it's super helpful to connect to your own motivation for why you're doing what you're doing, what gives you joy, what gives you purpose, what is your vision. So we have exercises on that. And then we have some particular frameworks around our own stuck places. What are our habits and patterns that we get stuck in when we are in conflict, to become familiar with those. Can we advance to the next slide? Yes. So this one, I just want to do a snapshot of one of my favorite ones in the self-exploration section, which is called the 4 archetypes. And archetypes are sort of common patterns that we collectively experience. And this tool talks about 4 of them that can be really useful as a diagnostic tool to check on yourself and figure out what you need to move forward in any given challenging situation. And it talks about the victim archetype, which is when in a challenging situation, you are in a space of overwhelm and more is coming at you than you can handle. It talks about the warrior archetype, which is when you have just enough energy to like push and fight back and set boundaries and make intentions to take action. And the leader healer archetype, which is when you have a little bit more energy to be able to hold a broader perspective and make and act in a way that's less reactive to what's coming at you and more visionary. And the creator archetype is actually the one that is able to hold and weave through all of these. And so in the workbook, we talk about each one of these being really useful for our learning, because each one has like a medicine that if you turn towards it, you can unlock. And if you ignore and push away, you're not going to be able to harvest the power of that particular archetype. And it's in the self-exploration segment, but it's also applicable in groups, because often there will be someone in a group that might be embodying more of a victim space and someone who's embodying more of a warrior, and there can be a mismatch. So it's useful as a diagnostic tool for groups as well. And what I like about it is like, it kind of points again to, if we're not if we don't have self-awareness, and if we're not fully embracing all of the warring parts of ourselves, we're not going to be able to really show up for and with other people towards our social change and transformation goals. Yeah, is there anything you want to say about the self-work section, Joe, or what our logic is?
Yeah, that part of what's hard about conflict often is that it brings up our own feelings and histories and unconscious habits, things, behavior patterns we get stuck in or triggered into. And starting with the self-work is a way to care for ourselves, and those things that come up in conflict that are hard, no one can make those go away for us. So we have to learn to be with ourselves in that experience. And really our relationship with ourselves is the foundation for our relationship with each other.
It reminds me of the quote by Black feminist, visionary, activist, and writer Toni Cade Bambara, who says, in the context of Black liberation, revolution begins with the self, in the self. And you can learn tools all day and night, but if you haven't transformed your own your own way of being, they're not going to get you very far. So we chose tools that we feel like point to that in this section.
Yeah, and
do we want to?
I just wanted to mention, you introduced me to this 4 archetypes model, and one of the things I really appreciate about it is that there's not a value judgment of one over the other, and how the model helps us connect with the strengths of each of these mindsets or kind of ways of relating. And so just to acknowledge that we all have had times of being in each of these states of mind, and that there can be good things that we can experience in that state of mind.
Totally. We do a whole workshop on just the archetypes, and it can get really juicy and have so many applications. So we encourage you to check that page out in the workbook and read more about it and practice with it and let us know how it goes for you. And feel free to drop in the chat if there's anything just from this little nutshell that sparks your interest or that you resonate with. Let's advance to the next slide. You want to talk about this, Jo, this part of the workbook?
Yeah, so these are common defense mechanisms that ways of kind of avoiding an uncomfortable situation, or responding, maybe is a better word, to an uncomfortable situation. These were first identified by relationship researcher John Gottman. And many people have found that they can apply to any kind of relationship. So they're behavior patterns that get us into trouble in conflict or in relationships. And kind of like the archetypes, we all might fall into any one of these. And in this case, each of us typically has a go-to pattern that we default to when we're triggered. And it's useful to know our own patterns. It's also useful to know our friends and comrades' patterns, because there's, Gottman in his research actually identified what we can try instead of these default patterns. So like the kind of remedies to these stuck places or stuck habits. Yeah, go ahead. I was about to pass it to you to talk about gifts.
Yeah, so like so for instance, we have an exercise in the workbook where you map which of these is your most habitual pattern and why, and you sort of reflect about why, because the secret is these all connect to a core need that's not being met, and just understanding like why you respond that way, you can sort of like tunnel down to that core need, and from there come to a place of deeper understanding of self and other people. And I've used this exercise, for example, with when I lived in a collective house, and people's defense habits were really triggering each other. And we just sat down one day and we were like, okay, which of these do you most use? And what do you think is, and Ebony, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide, what do you think is the core need that is really beneath that? And we were sort of surprised by the answers, and it really like helped melt the defensiveness to just be like, oh, you're stonewalling me because you feel like what I did was ignoring your sense of fairness. And it like, I could just see this like moment of glimmer of understanding between my warring roommates. So that's an example of an application for this tool. And we have a fun little quiz poll question for you all. Eva, would you mind pulling up the next poll question, which is for you all to think about, what is your go-to conflict habit out of the 4 that we listed? And also, what is the go-to conflict habit for your group's culture? And that could be, you could call to mind a group that you're in, whether that's your work group or organizing group or family or living situation. Be interested to see if there are any trends among us.
And while those answers are coming in, I'll just name in the workbook, there are some reflection worksheets to help you do that work of kind of digging into what your own needs might be, and also starting to relate to what the other person's needs might be, and how those needs might relate to each other.
Yeah, one interesting thing we found in my housing process was like our conflict habits often triggered each other, like because they triggered a missed core need. And so that person's conflict habit would emerge, thereby triggering the other person even more. And it was like this proliferation of defense mechanisms that was really painful to see. So this can help give some language and understanding for that. So yeah, maybe we can end the poll now.
Yeah, and go ahead and share. Great.
Yeah, so it looks like it looks like we are a group of stonewallers with defensiveness coming up in a close second, and third, personal criticism, and not a lot of contempt. I could see that being true, especially like in a justice crowd. And then for the go-to conflict habit for your group, defensiveness, interesting, and stonewalling second, criticism third, and contempt fourth. I'd be curious if anyone wanted to share in the chat an example of how these habits might come up in a group culture. For me, in an organization I was part of, stonewalling came up by avoiding decisions as a form of stonewalling in an organizational context. Let's see, anything in the chat? Subtweets as a passive aggressive form of contempt and avoidance. Personal criticism through identity politics, interesting. Multi-hour meetings, which one of those is that? Yeah, cool. Between roommates, stonewalling is easier than addressing the conflict, basically waiting for the conflict to pass via avoiding each other.
And just to name, in the workbook itself, we did share what you can try instead of these kind of troubling patterns, those habits that get us into trouble in relationship. And so there are some offerings in the workbook of ways to constructively engage when this particular pattern comes up. So like when stonewalling comes up, either for yourself or for someone you're in relationship with, how might you proceed to kind of align back towards trust?
Yeah, there's some really good examples coming in the chat, so I encourage you all to read through them. And we're going to take a little break now to integrate and digest and go to the bathroom. So we will be back at the, let's say in 10 minutes.
10 minutes, yeah.
So that's at the
35 after, yeah.
And Ebony, I would invite you to share music if you would like, but no pressure.
Ebony, I'm gonna do the sharing of the music right now.
Oh, great.
Miriam thinks my music tastes are trash. It's fine.
I do not think they are trash. I don't at all. I just think I have better taste. That's all. I didn't say that yours was trash. Oh, all right, I'm getting to it. I'm getting to it.
Like maybe, or maybe it's just what you say. Like maybe, or maybe this is just your color for today. You've seen the way they've done your boy, and your boy's still down after 300 years. Like maybe you better come around. Like maybe, or maybe you just talking trash. Like maybe, yeah, or maybe your color I'd better not ask. You've seen the way they've done your boy, and your boy's still crying for days in and days out. Like woman, you better wash your man's tears away. Maybe you're red, or maybe you're green. But your real color I've never seen. Like maybe, or maybe you just talking trash. Tell me, black baby, or really would you rather You see the time is running out and your man's been sad for ages and ages and ages. Like maybe it's time for you to wake up, come around, come around. Can you feel it, baby? I can. Excuse me. Do you think that maybe I'll touch you? Rain or shine, and when I'm in the rain is fine. I'm so ready to call it mine. Love is through your hair. I can tell you, baby, if you let that come out there, I can tell you, please don't share. Do you want me, please let me know. I can tell you, don't let it go and just let it show. I can tell you, I feel so deep that comes within. I can tell you, what kind of love am I in?
I just see Roxanne's hand is up. Roxanne, is that an accident or are you asking a question? Can you be in the chat? Accident. Okay, thank you.
So hi, everyone. We're going to keep going. Definitely see some amazing questions coming up. Actually, Leanne, do you want to talk about some of those questions before we move on?
Yeah, I see one that
We need
says,
to pin the interpreter.
Okay. Are we good to go? Okay. So the victim archetype is usually pathologized. What approaches help us access this archetype in a healing and generative way? Yeah, I think what I like about this framework is it really fully honors and embraces the gift of being in the victim archetype. If it's helpful, you know, every single hero's journey, myth, goddess story has a major part in which the protagonist, the hero, the shiro, the non-binary heroics is in a pit, is in the victim place where none of their tools or strategies are able to support them. And having a reverence for that space as a really generative place of knowing, I think is step one of learning. I think because it takes us out of the like, I have all the answers, to surrender, which is doesn't feel good, but can lead to possibilities to learn in unexpected answers to your questions. So for me, when I'm in the victim space, I'm learning more and more to be like, wow, okay, this is an opportunity to learn more deeply than I have ever had to learn before. That's really valuable. So when working with other people who are in the victim space, the primary practice is of tending to victim is really like turning towards, because really us and other people, when they're in the victim space, all we want is like acceptance, love, and liberation. So allowing that part of ourselves or the other person and victim to be seen, heard, offered care can often like dissolve some of the negative pitfalls of the victim space. So I don't know if that was helpful, but I appreciate the question a lot. Any other questions?
Listening. Oh, I was just going to comment that listening to you share that about the victim space reminds me of we have a mentor in common who, Norma Wang, who will remind us that life is fragile. Like we're here for a fleeting moment, and it is natural to have feelings about that. and that's what came up for me as you were sharing about the victim perspective, is like our life is but a blip. And there can be like sometimes that feels scary, and sometimes that helps us relish each moment.
Whew, yes. Thanks, Rosita. For instance, like when we can embrace the collective victim moment of the pandemic, you know, we can begin to learn like what needs to happen to address climate crisis, to address the health disparity, to like in deeper ways than was consciously available before, possibly for many people. So let's maybe take one more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think maybe let's wait on the questions around needs, because we will circle back to that in the section about courageous conversations. So I think we'll dig into some of that there.
Great. And there is one question about the positive learnings to the conflict habits. And Ebony, if you wouldn't mind sharing maybe refreshing the slides and then sharing them. I added the slide that has the positive, I think in the slide before this. Yes, the what to do instead. So this is in our workbook, but here are some examples of practices that you can use to interrupt the habits that undermine trust for each one. So, and we'll share this slide deck with you too. Okay, on to the next segment, yeah?
Yeah.
Ebony, if you wouldn't mind advancing. Yeah. You want to talk about this?
Want to kick us off? Okay, so we, just like in the self-exploration, we started with resourcing our group together, and particularly with the question of group chartering. Articulating together our vision, our purpose, our values, who we want to be together, how we want to be together. And we start there because this is something that helps set the container for dealing with hard times when they come up, and they're almost guaranteed to come up. And also, once we've done this work, it can also guide us when some of the hard times come up. And so, yes, one of the exercises we share is actually clarifying what guides us. So just to talk about this a little bit, vision we understand as where we're headed. And Norma Wong, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, has helped us think about very long-term visioning. So not just 1 year or 5 year, but thinking about future generations and what is the world that we're trying to create, 5 generations, 7 generations forward, and mapping backwards from there. So vision is where we're headed. Purpose is what motivates us towards that vision and what our group's unique contribution towards that vision is. And so if where we're headed is a world without prisons, there might be many contributions towards that world, including things like this, including direct actions to interrupt harm that's currently occurring. And so in purpose, we're naming this group is making this specific contribution towards the vision where we want to go. The values are what is most important to us in how we work together. And then the people, I like to think of people as who we're accountable to. And that might be we're accountable to each other and naming what that means to us. It also might be we're accountable, say in the case of prison abolition, we're accountable to people who are now or who have been previously incarcerated. And then the practices is our agreements for how we'll move together. And that, I'm sorry about the dog in the background. So practices are how we'll put our values into action. And that might be our internal agreements about even things like how we run a meeting. But it could also be practices for how we engage with our community. We have many questions or observations about this one.
You may wonder, why is it this exercise made it into a workbook about conflict? This seems like a strategy tool or like a, organizational or group development tool. It's like so many conflicts are actually about this. And like, if you don't clarify, I mean, conflict can be a way to clarify this, but it can also help to just start by clarifying vision, purpose, practices for your, so that when there's disagreements, you can be like, well, according to our compass, we're actually focusing on like accountability to this set of people. So, you know, you may feel strongly about this, but this is in alignment with what we've agreed on as a group. So that's why we have this, and also the decision-making tools in our workbook. So one of the things that we have is like a set of ways people make decisions, and lack of clarity about that like can lead to power hoarding, which is a white supremacist cultural pattern. But when you're clear, actually, we make these decisions through consensus, and you have responsibility to make these decisions actually on your own. That can help actually disrupt dominant culture patterns of racism and white supremacy in a group, by making it clear who actually is empowered to make decisions and why. Because if you don't, white supremacy just kind of sneaks its little way in.
Yeah, for sure. And so we presented this in a compass illustration, partly because just like if you're using a compass and a map to figure out where you're going to move, the compass itself doesn't tell you the next move. It helps you orient to the terrain that's right in front of you, and also to chart on the map how to get where you want to go. And so similarly, being clear on these elements will help us orient to how we want to move through whatever we're in the middle of. And Elizabeth has a great observation in the chat that this is the stuff will keep us going when conflict is tough, to remember what brings us together, what our shared vision is.
And this can be in friendships too. I just got into a huge beef with my bestie, and it was so helpful to just like reconnect to the vision, because I was about to be like, I'm done. But just like just reconnecting to like, I have a vision for this being a long, lifelong, like spiritual friendship of mutual support. And we both have that. And that vision was so compelling that I was able to just like woman up and just like face it, you know. and remember like that is what nourishes us and what we're working towards together.
Yeah, and a friend of mine actually shared that seeing this in our workbook helped her understand the divorce she's going through, because she realized that she and her husband had a shared vision for their life together, and that they no longer did. And it helped her come to peace with their separation. Yes. So in the workbook, we did suggest a couple practices that might be useful for your groups. And one we have mentioned earlier, the practice of appreciation and like actively giving each other love. You know, our brains neurologically, we have a bias towards noticing what we don't love. And so it can be so helpful to balance that by consciously practicing, celebrating what's working and letting each other know, and in multiple different ways. And then there's another practice around being conscious of how dominant culture patterns show up in your group. So Liam, do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, I would say if like one of the most important exercises in our workbook is the one that lays out, and I wish we had a slide, but we don't, of the dominant culture patterns that we adapted from a list of white supremacy culture patterns by Tema Okun. And it's sort of the reason that we need to make a practice of sort of like acknowledging and diagnosing when we are falling into dominant culture patterns is that it is the water that we swim in, and if we aren't actively interrupting it, it's running the show. So in our workbook, we have a couple of pages that outline what some of these common patterns are and the regenerative culture patterns that you might replace them with. And one way that we've heard of groups doing this is literally like a monthly assessment. Like, where are we noticing exceptionalism, power and control patterns of like power hoarding or paternalism show up? Where are we noticing perfectionism or, like scarcity show up? And how can we actively interrupt that? And also to say people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color and other folks can enact these dominant culture patterns. It's actually not an identity thing. It's like a broader structural issue that we all have to confront within ourselves.
Yeah, and we offered that in this conflict workbook. Obviously, that can be a source of conflict, but we actually offered it to encourage the practice of talking about it directly. Because this is the water we swim in and it shows up in us, like we can take out the shame element of it and start to be honest with each other and give each other feedback and actually practice together a different way of being.
Absolutely. So we dropped into the chat a prompt for folks to reflect on, if you'd like, how clear do you think your group is on guiding elements, vision, purpose, people, practices, values? And where do you think you might need more clarity? So just, you can reflect on that personally or feel free to share in the chat. And also any observations you have about how how like success and failure stories about disrupting dominant culture in your groups.
And I see in the chat a question about the dominant culture patterns and examples of that. And there's a whole list of them from Tema Okun, and we've sorted them into 3 categories. One is about power, exceptionalism, and control. The second is about quantification and measurement. And so things like it doesn't exist if it's not written down. And then like who has the power to actually write it down and like be the official story. I know one, and I'm forgetting, maybe you can help me, the third category. But I'll share one of the dominant culture patterns that I find showing up in me is the urge to like perform something that is not authentic to me, to feel like I have to project some kind of competence that is a facade. Yeah, binary thinking is definitely in there.
I see a comment that says, and I've noted that we will pause at the 55 mark for the switch in interpreters. In our group, we seem really great at identifying dominant culture patterns when the person is white, but when it comes to identifying, owning, or being accountable to it when folks are BIPOC, much more resistance. Yeah, that's an astute observation. I'm sure it's shared among others as well. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if we might move to the tip of the iceberg, because I know there is a bunch of juicy questions, and I want to make sure we make time for those too.
Yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock because we're about to pause.
Oh, true. Yes, we're about to pause in just a moment. Yeah, I'm reviewing. Oh, great. Ready to go.
Okay.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So we've reached the tip of the iceberg. And there's three primary tools or exercises that we offer in the workbook here.
Rita, I'm just going to pause for 1 second. The slide, people are on top of the slide, Ebony, so I'm not sure if people can see the slide. There seems to be a... Can you see can everybody else see? Oh, good. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So there's three exercises we've offered. And the first one is actually about giving and receiving feedback. And we're encouraging folks to practice that for low stakes situations because it's like, you know, building strength, building a muscle. And the more that we do it in low stakes situations, the more we'll be able to call on it when the stakes are higher. So really encourage you to take a look at that and explore that with your group. And then we do include a kind of template or something to start with for actually having a courageous conversation. And as I say that, I'll pause first and say a courageous conversation is when we take the risk to approach someone with feedback or requests about what isn't working, or pain points is how we framed it in the workbook. So we do offer kind of how you might approach that. But really the heart of this section is about preparing for a courageous conversation.
And really using that preparation as an opportunity again to learn about yourself and about your group. And so if we can advance the slide, this little treasure map came out of one of the workshops we created around the workbook. And it sort of helped us see that a challenging situation, a conflict, is really like a hero's journey to uncover a core need and see if it can be met. So you start off with the challenging situation and the self-work to identify the need. You uncover it, there it is, it's beautiful treasure. You unpack the stories that you have about the other person and or identify the stories that are shaping the situation through dominant culture. Then you start to think about strategies. And there was a question earlier on about how much do you recommend attending to an unmet need before addressing the conflict? Is it hard to move through the conflict if you don't seek out and remedy the unmet need? And I think it's helpful to point out here that there can be like a confusion between the need and a strategy. And oftentimes the thing we want the other person to do is the strategy to meet the need. And so it's useful to think of that strategy and formulate your requests and actually necessary. And at the same time, return to the need itself and try to imagine a variety of strategies to meet that need that don't necessarily rely on a person or group doing exactly what you need them to do. And that's kind of risky to say because, yeah, but it's true. It's like you really can't control what anyone is gonna do but yourself. So we do encourage people to go back to that need and find ways to meet it in creative and unexpected ways.
Can you maybe give an example of that, Liam, of like meeting one's own needs?
Yeah, I mean, with this, like with this friend, I am, we're in the same pod. So like, we're the only people that can share air together. And so I was just like, I have intense needs for like human interaction and you must meet them in these ways. But he just started a challenging job at a hospital and can't meet those needs in the ways that I want. Like, I was like, we need to hang out XYZ number of times a month for this many hours or else I will not feel met. And he kind of challenged me because he was just like, I wish, but I literally can't. And so I had to go back and reconnect with the pain, the victim space of like, ouch, 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 this sucks so much. I feel so like alone and I have such a need for connection, and really hit the drawing board again to imagine like, okay, how can I meet this need in other ways? And that looks like reaching out to more friends virtually. That looks like spending more time in nature. That looks like literally like hugging myself. So that got really personal really fast, but I hope that, and then so when I came to him again, it was like the pressure of it was released and he could really just give me what he could and give it freely. And that felt so much better than like keeping this weight of obligation on him to meet the need in the way I wanted, because you don't want a person to meet you because they feel like obligated or forced. That's like a value of mine. I don't want to take what isn't freely offered. So
yeah, and so the question that someone offered around like, do we try to meet the need first, or should we go into addressing it together first? And I feel like this relates to one of the other questions in the Q&A around embodying the practices so that they're not formulas. Because I think like with that question about where do you start around meeting needs, you can start either, both, both and so it's about kind of feeling into what feels right to you or what feels accessible to you as a starting place.
Totally. Is there anything else we want to say about the Courageous Conversation segment before we open it up for more broad discussion? Oh, we had one question for the prompt for the chat, if you want to drop in the chat. Where do you tend to get tripped up on the treasure map? What's the one place you tend to avoid and might want to give a little bit of attention to? Anything else you want to add, Joe?
Yeah, so, just to name that, obviously this is a key practice for turning towards each other, but specifically the preparation for the conversation itself. It's a way of showing up for ourselves. And it is a way to continue learning about our own needs and our own unconscious patterns. And the more that we've worked with this content, the more we're seeing it as an opportunity to really honor our relationship with ourselves, and naming our needs and inviting others to meet us there, but starting with ourselves.
Totally. I got totally sucked into an awesome comment in the chat. From Claudia, a facilitator I admire, Nelo Zidane, recently offered about this current moment. Everybody needs more than everyone can give right now. Whether you believe this is true or not, sometimes needs cannot all be met at the same time. So maybe this is also the victim place, understanding and accepting or mourning or grieving that. Yes, that is a part of being human for sure. And so much for those of us who have been impacted by extractive systems. There's so much grief there because we really have been kept from having our basic needs met by these systems for so long that there can be a tremendous pressure for individuals to meet that when it's really structures that have failed us. Yeah.
I think another thing to say before we move into questions fully is that we offer these tools as resources, not prescriptions. And particularly the template for a conversation, it's kind of our riff on nonviolent communication technique. Well, I'll say technique and say nonviolent communication is often used in a very formulaic way, and it can become rigid and a way that dominant culture patterns are enacted on each other, on ourselves and each other. And that's not our intention here. So any tool can be misused, especially when we are in a victim state or a warrior state. And the key to using them as a resource and not a prescription is to tune into your own inner guidance and your gut wisdom and your relationship with yourself.
Major key, exactly. Let's do more discussion and Q&A, yeah? Does that sound good?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. In the Q&A, oh, this one is juicy. Can there be conflict transformation if only one party is doing self-work? What do you think, Joe?
I would love folks to drop in the chat if you have thoughts on this one. Yeah, I have definitely been in relationships where I felt like I was the only one doing the work. And I don't know. I mean, one thought that comes up here is that part of conflict transformation is our own relationship with ourselves. And so thinking about that iceberg slide that we shared earlier, you know, we can tend to the part of the iceberg that is about our relationship with ourselves, even if the other person is not interested in doing that for themselves.
And then eventually the compassionate thing might be to bring in a boundary.
Yeah.
You know, because you can't just endlessly give, you know, energy and availability if someone isn't meeting you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Lauren.
The next one, I found it hard to think about how my group culture responds to conflict because most of the groups I'm part of are broadly conflict avoidant. So it's hard to know the response. Do you have any ideas for practices/approaches groups can have to bring and welcome conflict addressing into the space? Joe?
Well, that's part of why we wrote this workbook, is to help introduce the conversation. And so, you know, it's freely available. You can share it, download it, you know, offer it up. Like, I came across this resource. I would be excited to explore this together. Can we have that conversation? So that's one starting place.
I also think about, Joe, when you talk about feedback as an easy place to start. What is an easy, low stakes conflict that you can gently bring in to start using that muscle? And are the channels of communication open in other ways, like basic feedback? Because that can be a good place to start. Yeah, send them the recording to this webinar. I don't know. Thank you for that. Let's see. So I'm wondering about the role of generative conflict when the goal isn't to come to agreement or a shared strategy at the end. For example, if you're part of an organizing collective with different organizing priorities and strategies, how can this approach to conflict help the group clarify those differences and maybe work along them to flourish without expecting them to be resolved, and also without minimizing / avoiding the differences? This might be a question about consensus, not about conflict. Thoughts? Anyone is welcome to drop thoughts into the chat too. It's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing that comes to mind is just to name that the differences can be productive. And we didn't include in the workbook itself, but there is in the resource section of the workbook, there's a tool around mapping paradoxes. Do I have that right? Yeah. And there's a way of mapping, like if there, polarities is what I'm looking for, mapping polarities. And so to name like what's the upside and the potential pitfall of two poles that seem to be in dynamic tension with each other. And that can be really helpful for a group to orient towards holding those tensions in a way that helps the group meet its purpose.
Yeah, I've recently used the polarity map in a Arab feminist collective where there wasn't a lot of alignment around shared strategy or goals, but we could sort of be differentiated. Like there could be the group that does healing, the group that doesn't understand healing but isn't going to get in the way of that, and the group that's doing like direct action. And the polarity mapping allowed us to see the importance of all of those contributions and the potential pitfalls. Let's see.
Yeah, there's a question about conflict resources for very young children. And this is another one, if folks on the call might know resources, please drop them in the chat. I will offer some mentors of mine do work around what they call natural learning relationships. And they identify like what are the developmental needs of a particular age group, and how can the adult be in relationship to nourish those specific developmental needs. And there may be some insights in that model for you. And I'll type that out in the chat, the name.
Thanks, Joe. I saw a cute suggestion to an earlier question. My conflict avoidant housemates and I implemented a circle of doom time during weekly meetings as a kind of silly way to make space for any concerns / feedback / issues that needed to be addressed. Yeah, fully embracing the doom feelings associated with conflict. I think we are supposed to pause here in a moment. Is that true, to change out the interpreters?
Oh, in a moment.
I'm just gonna wait. Oh, good to go. Okay, great. I'm a little like, woo, which question pulled in a lot of direction?
Totally. I wanted to go back to the question about preventing the practices from being formulaic. I think this is a challenge for all of us. And we were actually having a conversation earlier today, Liam and I, that there are some serious limitations to any tool that's about relationships. Because there are some ways that if you rely on the tool instead of on embodiment, it can actually get in your way. Do you have any, I know we talked a little bit about this earlier. Liam, do you have any thoughts on how to stick with the embodiment?
If you notice yourself contracting and resisting a tool, that's a great moment to practice turning towards the victim space or the warrior space and just being like I'm listening to you. What's going on, to yourself, you know, or your group, and just being like, I know this is what we should be doing, but like I'm not in alignment here, and really making space to voice why. And there could be some awesome insights that come out of that when you're able to intervene and notice that for yourself. Let's see. I saw an interesting question in the chat, and I wonder if you have thoughts on this, Joe. I'm in the middle of a pretty high stakes conflict at work, a social justice nonprofit with little to no processes for accountability or conflict resolution in place. Any guidance on how to bring tools from the workbook to my workplace, given the advice to start with low stakes conflict?
Can you say the first part again about the workplace?
Oh yeah, it's the person is in the middle of a high stakes conflict at work, a social justice nonprofit with little to no processes for accountability or conflict resolution in place.
Yeah. Well, the first thought that comes to mind is it possible, it's a question really, is it possible for the group to acknowledge how uncomfortable the situation is? And not even framing like blame or who's responsible, but just to name like things are really tense or really hard right now. And can we find a way to talk about that? That might be one starting place. And just to name, it can be really super useful to get help from someone who is not actively involved. And I know that's something that can be hard when you're in the middle of it, but it can be so helpful.
Yeah, it's just from experience, it's really hard to facilitate a conflict that you're part of. So if that's possible, I also really recommend it. How important, this one's interesting. I'm not sure how to answer it, but how important is it to still address conflict in an organization where the primary people who were in conflict have left? I'm wondering about the residual impact of conflict on bystanders and onlookers.
Yeah, it sounds like you are observing that there is some residual impact, and that sounds like it's worth talking about. And definitely, group culture is a living, adapting system, network of relationships. And also, there can be echoes from people who used to be in the group who aren't there anymore. And it can be useful for the group to bring that to consciousness and make some choices around that.
I just wanted to, sorry. This is Miriam. I just wanted to add one thing around that, which is it can be useful if it's not focused on gossip. So
yeah.
I've been in groups, and I've also facilitated groups where the people are gone. And what Shira calls Destiny's Child is happening, which is a game of like telephone tag of the story about the story that gets retold in the group. And we're not actually talking about what happened. We're talking about actually a new thing. And I find a lot of groups are really stuck on the gossip of the fight that happened that half the people in the room weren't even there for. So there is a question about whether maybe it just needs to be the people who were there at the time who talk about it together because they have actual information, rather than a bunch of people adding 2 cents in that they had zero information about in the first place. I've seen groups go down doing that.
Totally. Thank you for that, because I think an important clarification is I don't know that it's useful to unpack everything that happened in the past. But what can be useful is to look at like how might our group's history be shaping how we are together now, and do we want to continue that? And so that's about the people who are here currently, not about the people who used to be here.
Absolutely. Looking for another question, looking for tools to respond to people in the victim archetype when you're feeling hurt by that person and don't want to take care of them / be around them. Yeah, that's a great boundary. By no means do I mean to imply that we should take care of everyone in the group in the victim place. I would say maybe if you are like explicitly a leader or facilitator of that group, it might be somewhat your responsibility, and you get to draw boundaries about that. If it's, for example, like an issue of white fragility that is triggering for you, or, so I would say at that point, the responsibility is to tend to yourself, draw the boundaries from your warrior place that need to be drawn, and kind of like trust that that person will get the support that they need. We can't really micromanage that for people in victim space. Joe, do you have thoughts?
I was actually focused on answering a couple of the easier to answer questions in typing form.
Great. Yeah. So let's see. Would love to explore more ways to overcome shame in conflict. This will be the last question. How to embrace that aspect in practice in our relationships and groups. Yes. So shame is one of the most tricky, sticky aspects of the victim space. Brene Brown has a huge, really comprehensive body of research and work on this issue. Yeah, shame is tricky because shame doesn't like to be seen. So actually, I want to say sort of like normalizing shame and treating it super delicately and gently is what I would do. Yeah, I don't know. Joe, do you have thoughts on shame?
Well, I shared earlier, I see in myself the dominant culture pattern around like projecting something that's not true to me. And what has really helped me interrupt that habit and open myself up to more authenticity is to actually share about it. And you know, I started doing that in very like low stakes situations and with people who I trusted. And the more that I did it, the more comfortable it got. And my sense is that that's true for other ways that shame can show up as well.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you for all of these amazing, amazing, juicy questions. We appreciate all of the reflections and wisdom that was shared and generated through them. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's time for us to start to come to a close. So Jovita and I have been thinking about like, okay, we're offering this workbook. What's the next sort of iteration? What do we want to offer next? And we're in the process of maybe designing some different offerings. We might go into a deeper dive into particular tools and do some one-off workshops in the future. And we're also thinking about creating a deeper dive group that wants to explore these together so that we can get into more of these specific sort of questions that are coming up and really like be in collective exploration together. So those are some future offerings that we're thinking about putting forth into the world. And Abhinay, would you mind sharing the last slide, number 15? So we would love if folks who are interested, we don't have like a web page or anything yet, but we would super love if folks who are interested would fill out what they might be interested in connecting more about using this, one more slide forward, this survey in terms of like, what are you hungry for? What do you need? What do your people need? And so we have that up there and in the chat, and we have some ways for you to connect directly with both of us and each of us. And we want to take a moment to, can we go back one slide now? To say big thank you to the wonderful folks at Project Mia for inviting us, Mariam for supporting and inviting us, Eva for your amazing coordination, and all of Abhinay and all of the team who are doing interpretation, closed captioning, and graphic recording. We're so happy to be here. Thank you so much.